The conductor's hand was shaking before he even reached the seat. It was 1935, and the train was moving south through Georgia on a route that had run the same way for decades, carrying the same kind of passengers in the same kind of arrangement that the South had built for itself and called natural, called proper, called the way things were and always would be. The whites-only car at the front of the train was filled with the particular comfort of people who had never had to think about whether they belonged somewhere. Businessmen reading newspapers, a family traveling to visit relatives. The low murmur of conversations that assumed, without ever needing to articulate the assumption, that everyone in the car shared the same basic understanding of how the world was organized. And then there was a man sitting near the window, reading his own newspaper, dressed in a suit that fit him with the kind of precision that suggested money and taste in equal measure, who did not belong there. According to every rule, the South had spent generations perfecting and enforcing. Bumpy Johnson did not look up when the conductor approached. He had heard the man's footsteps coming down the aisle, had heard the particular quality of hesitation in those footsteps. The sound of someone walking toward a confrontation they didn't want to have, but felt obligated to start anyway. He continued reading. "Sir," the conductor's voice cracked slightly on the single syllable. "Sir, you can't be here." Bumpy folded his newspaper with the unhurried precision of a man who had nowhere else he needed to be, and all the time in the world to get there. He looked up. The other passengers in the car had gone still in the particular way that people go still when they sense that something is happening that falls outside their understanding of how things are supposed to proceed. Some of them were watching directly. Others were watching in the reflections of windows, in the angles of their peripheral vision, the careful surveillance of people who want to see everything while appearing to see nothing. "Can't be where?" Bumpy said. His voice was calm, almost gentle. The conductor, whose name, though nobody in that car knew it yet, was Thomas Williams, swallowed hard. "This is the whites-only car, sir. I'm going to need you to move to the colored car. I don't want any trouble." Trouble. Bumpy's eyebrow rose slightly, the gesture of a man considering an unfamiliar word. "Who said anything about trouble? I paid for my ticket, same as everyone else here." "Same as you, sir. You paid for your ticket, didn't you, when you boarded this train this morning?" The question didn't quite make sense to Williams. Not in the moment, and several of the white passengers exchanged glances that carried the specific confusion of people watching a script deviate from its expected lines. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. The black man was supposed to be embarrassed, apologetic, eager to resolve the situation as quickly and quietly as possible. Instead, he was sitting there, with his newspaper folded in his lap, asking questions that didn't seem to be questions at all, in a tone that suggested he had already had this exact conversation many times before, and found it each time mildly interesting in an academic sort of way. To understand what was happening in that train car, and what was about to happen to a man named Senator James Whitmore, you have to go back 5 years, to 1930, to a young man who arrived in Harlem with $47 in his pocket and a mind that worked differently than the minds of almost everyone he would encounter. Ellsworth Johnson had grown up in Charleston, South Carolina, the son of a woman named Margaret Johnson, who cleaned houses during the day and ran numbers at night, who taught her son 2 things that would define the rest of his life. Never forget where you came from, and never let anyone disrespect your family. By the time he was 15, Ellsworth had developed a reputation, Not for violence, though he could handle himself when necessary, but for something rarer and more dangerous. He had developed a reputation for being 3 steps ahead of everyone else in every room he entered. By 1935, Bumpy Johnson was beginning to be known in the specific circles that mattered, the circles where information traveled faster than newspapers and where reputation was built one careful demonstration at a time. And on this particular train, heading south on a trip that officially had nothing to do with anything except a family matter requiring his presence in Atlanta, Bumpy Johnson was about to provide one of those demonstrations. Though calling it a demonstration suggests something more deliberate than what was actually happening. What was actually happening was simpler and stranger. Bumpy Johnson had bought a first-class ticket, and he intended to sit in the seat that ticket entitled him to. Everything else that followed was, in a sense, just the world's reaction to something that should never have needed to be remarkable in the first place. "I paid for my ticket," Bumpy repeated, in case the first time hadn't been clear. "Same as everyone else." A heavy-set man near the back of the car stood up. He was well-dressed, the kind of well-dressed that suggested business success of a particular regional variety. And his face had gone the specific shade of red that men's faces go when they feel that their understanding of the world has been personally insulted. "Look here, boy," the man said, his voice carried easily through the car. "You heard the conductor. This ain't your place." Bumpy turned toward him. The movement was slow, deliberate, the movement of a man redirecting his attention rather than reacting to a threat. "My place?" Bumpy said. "That's right. Your people got their own car. Now move along before we have to make you move." There was a murmur of agreement from several other passengers. The sense of safety that comes from numbers, from the assumption that the existing order would, of course, reassert itself. That this strange interruption would resolve itself the way these things always resolved themselves. Bumpy looked at the man for a long moment. Then he said something that nobody in that car expected, that didn't seem to connect to anything that had been said, that sounded, for a moment, like a complete non sequitur. "You know what's interesting?" Bumpy said. "I was reading in the paper today about a businessman from Atlanta, name of Harold Morrison. Does that name ring any bells?" The heavy-set man's face changed. Not all at once. The change moved across his features the way weather moves across a landscape, starting at the edges and spreading inward. The red flush of indignation didn't disappear exactly, but something else began to overlay it, something that looked, to anyone paying close attention, remarkably like fear. Because Harold Morrison, as it turned out, was the heavy-set man's own name. And the article Bumpy was referring to, an article that had run that very morning in a paper that Morrison himself had not yet had occasion to read, concerned an investigation into government contracting fraud, an investigation into a businessman who had been systematically overcharging the military for supplies for years. An investigation that had apparently begun with an anonymous tip and had developed in a remarkably short time into something that federal investigators were describing as airtight. "Seems Mr. Morrison has been having some trouble with his government contracts lately," Bumpy continued, his voice maintaining the same conversational tone it had carried throughout the entire exchange. "Something about overcharging the military for supplies. Peculiar thing, though. The evidence just appeared out of nowhere. Anonymous tip, they say. Funny how these things work out sometimes." Morrison sat down. Hard. The motion was involuntary. The motion of a man whose legs had simply stopped functioning as legs are supposed to function. The other passengers were confused now, in a different way than before. They had been confused by the strange calm of a black man refusing to move to the colored car. Now, they were confused by something else entirely, by the sudden and total collapse of a man who, 30 seconds earlier, had been standing in righteous indignation, and who was now sitting with his face the color of old paper, staring at the man he had just called boy with an expression that contained nothing of its earlier confidence. "You see, gentlemen," Bumpy said, and now he was speaking to the car at large, his voice carrying easily to every corner of it. "I believe in treating people with respect, and I've found that when you treat people right, they tend to remember that. They tend to help you out when you need it." He turned to the conductor, who was standing in the aisle, sweating despite the cool air coming through the windows. "Take the conductor here, for instance. Mr. Williams, isn't it? Thomas Williams, from Birmingham." Williams's eyes went wide. He hadn't given his name. Nobody had introduced him. There was no way, no possible way, for a stranger on this train to know his name, let alone where he was from. "Got a daughter studying to be a teacher, if I'm not mistaken," Bumpy continued, his tone unchanged, the tone of a man making pleasant small talk at a social gathering. "Mary, isn't it? Bright girl. Real bright. Got herself a scholarship to Tuskegee Institute, I understand." Williams's mouth opened. Nothing came out. "Shame if something happened to that scholarship," Bumpy said. "Shame if certain financial irregularities came to light in her application. These institutions, they're very careful about that sort of thing. One irregularity, even a small one, even one that's not really anyone's fault, and a scholarship like that can disappear awfully fast." The silence in the car had become a physical presence, something with weight and texture, something that pressed against the windows and the upholstered seats and the faces of everyone present. "But that's not going to happen," Bumpy said, and now there was something almost kind in his voice, the kindness of a man offering reassurance about a danger he had just himself introduced. "Because Mr. Williams here is a good man. An honest man. And honest men understand that sometimes the right thing to do isn't necessarily what the rule book says." Thomas Williams looked around the car. Every white face was looking back at him, waiting, the unspoken expectation hanging in the air as clearly as if it had been announced over the train's intercom. "Enforce the rule. Make the colored man move. That's what conductors do. That's what the situation requires." But Bumpy Johnson wasn't threatening Williams's daughter's future. Not exactly. He was offering Williams a choice. The same choice, in a way that the entire car was facing without quite understanding it yet. Play by the old rules. The rules everyone in this car had grown up believing were as permanent and unchangeable as the weather, and watch what happens, or step into something else. Something where the rules were different, and where the man sitting by the window with the folded newspaper was, in ways nobody in the car yet fully understood, the one writing them. "Now," Bumpy said, settling back into his seat, "I paid for a first-class ticket. I'm a first-class passenger, and I intend to ride in first-class accommodations. Anyone got a problem with that?" The car erupted into whispered conversations, angry murmurs. Someone mentioned calling the railroad authorities, calling the police, calling someone, anyone who could restore the situation to something recognizable. But the voices died down, one by one, faster than anyone in that car would have predicted 30 minutes earlier, because Harold Morrison wasn't saying anything. And Harold Morrison, before this moment, had been the loudest voice in the car, the man whose outrage had given everyone else permission to feel their own outrage. With Morrison silent, staring at his hands, the rest of the car's confidence drained away with a speed that surprised even the people experiencing it. "Conductor," Bumpy said, without looking up from the newspaper he was unfolding again, "I believe you have other cars to attend to." Thomas Williams nodded. The nod was small, almost imperceptible, but it was a nod, and everyone in that car saw it, and everyone in that car understood what it meant, even if none of them could have explained in that moment exactly how it had come to mean what it meant. "Yes, sir, Mr. Johnson," Williams said. "Yes, sir." He walked away down the aisle, and the car slowly returned to something that resembled normal, though it was a different normal than the one that had existed 20 minutes earlier. Conversations resumed, but quieter. Newspapers were picked back up, but not really read. Every person in that car was now aware, in a way they hadn't been aware before, that something had happened that they didn't have a framework for understanding, and that the man by the window, reading his newspaper with the calm of someone for whom nothing remarkable had occurred, was somehow at the center of it. What none of them knew, not Harold Morrison, not Thomas Williams, not any of the dozen other passengers in that car, was that what they had just witnessed was not the event, it was the setup. The train was still moving south. There were more stops ahead, and the man Bumpy Johnson had really come to see, the reason for this entire journey, hadn't boarded yet. 20 minutes passed. The train wheels clicked against the rails in their steady rhythm, the sound that train passengers stop hearing after the first few minutes of any journey. The sound that becomes the silence against which everything else happens. Bumpy sat with his newspaper, appearing to read, appearing to be exactly what he appeared to be, a well-dressed man passing time on a long journey. He was not passing time, he was waiting. And he knew, with the particular certainty of a man who has spent 5 years building a structure so carefully that its eventual completion feels less like an achievement and more like an inevitability, exactly what was coming next, and when, and what it would mean. The train pulled into Montgomery, Alabama. Bumpy watched through the window as passengers disembarked and others boarded, the ordinary churn of a railway station, and his attention sharpened almost imperceptibly when a particular figure stepped onto the platform and made his way toward the car. The man was unremarkable in every visible way. Average height, average build, wearing the simple uniform of a railroad inspector, a clipboard in one hand. He moved through the car with the practiced, slightly bored efficiency of a man performing a routine task he had performed 1,000 times before, checking tickets, making small notations, the kind of figure that exists in the peripheral vision of train travel, present but unremarked upon. His name badge read J. Patterson. Nobody in that car paid him any attention. Nobody except Harold Morrison, whose eyes, when they landed on the approaching inspector, went wide with an expression that, to anyone watching closely, looked like recognition mixed with something close to panic. Patterson moved down the aisle, checking tickets, making his notes, and when he reached Morrison's seat, he paused. He leaned down to examine Morrison's ticket with the same bored efficiency he had shown with every other passenger. And then, in a voice loud enough for the surrounding seats to hear clearly, he said, "Mr. Morrison, I'm going to need to see some additional identification, sir." "What?" Morrison's voice came out strangled. Why? Routine inspection, sir. Railroad policy. But it wasn't routine, because J. Patterson wasn't a railroad inspector. He was Special Agent Jerome Patterson of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the badge he was about to produce, the badge that had been concealed beneath the inspector's uniform for this entire journey, was about to transform this train car from a setting for an uncomfortable racial confrontation into the setting for something else entirely. Mr. Morrison, Patterson said, and now his voice had changed, had taken on the unmistakable register of federal authority, the tone that exists nowhere else and that everyone, regardless of background, recognizes instantly. You're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and violation of federal contracting regulations. The car erupted. It is difficult to overstate the scale of the reversal that occurred in that train car in the span of about 90 seconds. 20 minutes earlier, the car had been united, more or less, in a shared assumption about how the world worked, an assumption that placed a well-dressed black man in a position of presumed inferiority regardless of what he had paid for or what rights he technically possessed. Now, that same car was watching one of its own, a man whose outrage had set the tone for everyone else's outrage. Being handcuffed by a federal agent while passengers gasped and whispered and tried to process what, exactly, had just happened to their understanding of who held power in this space. Morrison started babbling about lawyers, about rights, about connections that he claimed would make this entire situation disappear within hours. Patterson's response was calm, almost gentle, the response of a man who had heard this exact speech many times before and found it, by this point in his career, almost soothing in its predictability. Your connections are exactly why you're under arrest, sir, Patterson said. Conspiracy requires accomplices. You gave us quite a list. As Patterson led Morrison away down the aisle, toward the door at the end of the car, Morrison's eyes found Bumpy Johnson. For just a moment, their gazes met. Morrison's eyes were filled with something that had no name yet, a combination of terror and dawning, horrified understanding. Bumpy's eyes, in that same moment, contained nothing but the calm, patient satisfaction of a man who had said checkmate several moves before his opponent realized the game had started. Bumpy turned the page of his newspaper. The real genius of what was happening, though, wasn't the arrest itself. Any sufficiently well-connected operator could tip off federal investigators about corruption, could set in motion an arrest, could orchestrate a moment of public humiliation for a man who deserved it. What happened next was the part that separated what Bumpy Johnson was doing from anything that had been done before in this context by anyone. As the train pulled away from Montgomery, a new passenger entered the whites-only car. He was a black man, well-dressed, carrying a leather briefcase with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to occupying important spaces. He walked down the aisle without hesitation and took a seat in the middle of the car, an empty seat that 20 minutes earlier no black passenger would have dared approach, let alone occupy, without immediate and severe consequence. The white passengers, who had just witnessed Morrison's arrest, who had just watched their understanding of the rules collapse in real time, looked at this new arrival with an expression that contained no anger at all, only confusion. A deep, almost vertiginous confusion, the confusion of people who no longer knew what the rules were, or whether rules in any meaningful sense still applied. Thomas Williams approached the new passenger. His hands, which had stopped shaking after his earlier exchange with Bumpy, began shaking again. "Sir," Williams said, I need to see your ticket." The man handed over his papers without a word. Williams examined them. His eyes widened. "These are first-class tickets," Williams said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's correct." Williams looked around the car. Every face was turned toward him, waiting. But the waiting had a different quality now than it had had with Bumpy. Nobody was expecting Williams to enforce anything. Nobody, after what had just happened to Morrison, seemed entirely sure what enforcement would even mean, or what consequences might follow from it, or whether the entire framework within which enforcement made sense had, in some way nobody could quite articulate, simply stopped existing somewhere over the last half hour. "Welcome aboard, sir," Williams said finally. "Can I get you anything? Coffee? A newspaper?" The man smiled. "Coffee would be nice, thank you." As Williams walked away to fetch the coffee, the white passengers sat in a silence that was different from any silence that had occurred in that car before. They had just watched a conductor welcome a black passenger into the whites-only car as though it were the most natural thing in the world, offering him coffee with the same courtesy he would extend to any other first-class passenger. But Bumpy Johnson, watching all of this over the top of his newspaper, knew that this, too, was not the end of anything. The man who had just sat down was not a random passenger making a point. He was Dr. Charles Hamilton, professor of constitutional law at Howard University, and the briefcase he carried contained documents that would, over the following months and years, contribute to the dismantling of an entire legal architecture that had governed railroad segregation across the South for generations. Documents that traced the connections between segregated transportation policy and the same kind of federal contracting fraud that had just ended Harold Morrison's career and freedom in the span of a single train ride. What none of the passengers in that car yet understood, what wouldn't become clear until the train reached its final destination, was that everything they had witnessed so far, Morrison's exposure, his arrest, Dr. Hamilton's arrival, all of it was preparation. The real move, the one that would matter most, the one that would echo through American political history in ways that none of these passengers, sitting in their seats, with their coffee and their newspapers, and their slowly dawning realization that the world had changed somewhere between Montgomery and wherever they were now, could have begun to imagine. The train approached Atlanta's Union Station as evening fell. The atmosphere in the whites-only car had become something that none of the regular passengers had words for, an electric, uncertain quiet, the quiet of people waiting for an explanation that hadn't arrived yet. Watching a man read a newspaper with the patience of someone who knew exactly what was coming and felt no need to hurry it along. At exactly 6:47 in the evening, as the train's whistle announced its arrival into the station, 3 men in expensive suits boarded the car. They moved with the unhurried confidence of men who were accustomed to spaces rearranging themselves around their presence, and the lead man, tall, silver-haired, with the bearing of someone who had spent decades being the most important person in every room he entered, scanned the car until his eyes found Bumpy Johnson. "Well, well," the man said. His voice carried the particular cadence of Southern aristocracy, the drawl that signals generations of inherited authority. "If it isn't Ellsworth Johnson, I hear you've been causing quite a stir on this train." The other passengers in the car, who had spent the last hour watching their understanding of reality slowly dissolve, now found themselves witnessing something that, in its own way, was more disorienting than anything that had come before. Because the man standing in the aisle, addressing Bumpy Johnson by name, with the easy familiarity of someone greeting an old acquaintance, was Senator James Whitmore of Georgia, chairman of the Railroad Commission, one of the most powerful men in the entire state, a man whose career had been built, brick by brick, on the foundation of racial segregation, on the maintenance of exactly the kind of social order that this train car had, until about an hour ago, perfectly represented. And he was standing in a whites-only train car, talking to a black man as though they were equals. As though, in some sense that none of the other passengers could quite grasp, they had always been equals. And the entire elaborate performance of segregation that surrounded them was simply a stage set that both men understood, in some fundamental way, to be temporary. Bumpy folded his newspaper. "Senator Whitmore," he said, "right on time." The passengers gasped. "You've made a serious mistake, boy," Whitmore said, and his voice hardened, the aristocratic drawl sharpening into something with an edge to it. "Harold Morrison was under my protection. That little stunt with the FBI won't stand. I have friends, important friends." Bumpy stood. The movement was slow, deliberate, unhurried, the movement of a man who had been sitting for a long time and was simply stretching, except that everyone in that car understood, immediately, that this was not simply a man stretching. "Funny thing about friends, Senator," Bumpy said. "Sometimes they disappoint you." Dr. Hamilton, who had been sitting quietly with his coffee since boarding, reached into his briefcase and produced a small device, a recording device, the kind of technology that most of the passengers in that car had never seen before and would have struggled to identify if they had. "You see," Bumpy continued, his voice carrying easily through the car, the same conversational tone he had used with the conductor an hour earlier, the same tone he would use, it seemed, regardless of what he was discussing or who he was discussing it with. "Mr. Morrison was very talkative when Agent Patterson questioned him. Very talkative indeed." Whitmore's confident expression flickered, just slightly. Whatever lies that criminal told to save his own skin. "Oh, he didn't just talk, Senator." Bumpy nodded toward Dr. Hamilton, who pressed a button on the device. Harold Morrison's voice filled the car, tinny, distorted slightly by the recording technology, but unmistakable. Of course, Whitmore knew about the overcharges. Hell, it was his idea. He said the government was throwing money around like confetti, and we'd be fools not to grab our share. He took 20% of every inflated contract. The recording continued, but Whitmore had stopped listening. His face, which had begun the encounter with the easy confidence of a man greeting a familiar adversary, had gone through several rapid transformations and had now settled into something ashen, something that looked, in the dim evening light, filtering through the train windows, like the face of a much older man than the one who had boarded a few minutes earlier. "That recording is inadmissible," Whitmore said. His voice had lost its drawl entirely now, had become flat, urgent. "Illegally obtained, no court would." "Who said anything about court, Senator?" Bumpy's smile was cold. "See, you taught me something important about power. You taught me that sometimes the threat is more valuable than the action." Dr. Hamilton pulled out a second device. This one was larger, more complex, with an antenna that extended several inches above its housing. "This is a broadcast transmitter," Hamilton explained to the fascinated passengers, his voice calm, almost professorial, the voice of a man giving a guest lecture. "Experimental technology from the university, range of about 50 miles. Whitmore's eyes went wide with sudden, complete understanding. "You wouldn't dare." Wouldn't dare what? Bumpy asked, his tone the picture of innocence. Share the truth with the good people of Georgia? Let them know how their tax dollars have been stolen, how their elected officials have been profiting from their misery, while telling them that the real threat to their way of life was sitting in train cars they weren't supposed to be in.
The two men flanking Whitmore, his associates, his protection, whatever role they had imagined themselves playing when they boarded this train, looked increasingly uncertain. They could see the way the other passengers in the car were looking at their employer now. They could feel, in the way that people in dangerous professions develop a feel for these things, the way the entire atmosphere of the car had shifted, the way power, which 30 seconds ago had clearly belonged to the senator, now seemed to be flowing in a different direction entirely, toward a man who had spent the last hour sitting quietly by the window with a folded newspaper. "You don't understand," Whitmore said, desperation creeping into his voice. "This isn't just about money. This is about order, about maintaining the natural way of things, without segregation, without proper boundaries, without the illegal federal subsidies that fund your entire political machine," Dr. Hamilton interrupted, opening his briefcase wider to reveal a thick stack of documents and photographs. "We have everything, Senator, every bribe, every kickback, every illegal deal you've made for the past 15 years. The white passengers, who less than an hour earlier had watched a black man refuse to move to the colored car with outraged certainty, were now watching one of the most powerful men in Georgia politics dismantled in public by that same man, using evidence assembled with a patience none of them had categories for. "Here's what's going to happen," Bumpy said, his voice calm and reasonable. "You're going to walk off this train, you're going to go home, and you're going to announce your retirement from politics. Health reasons, maybe. Spend more time with the family. And if I refuse," Bumpy gestured to Dr. Hamilton, who held up the small antenna connected to the broadcast device, "then the people of Georgia are going to hear exactly what kind of man they've been electing." Tonight, during prime radio time, Whitmore looked around the car, at the white passengers who were no longer looking at him with the automatic deference that decades of power had trained them to provide, at his own bodyguards, who were quietly, almost imperceptibly, stepping back, putting distance between themselves and a man whose protection, it was becoming increasingly clear, was no longer worth very much. At Thomas Williams, the conductor, who was staring at him with an expression that contained no sympathy at all. "You've destroyed me," Whitmore said. The words came out as barely a whisper. "No, Senator," Bumpy replied. "You destroyed yourself. I just made sure everyone would find out about it." As the train pulled into Union Station, Senator James Whitmore walked off that car a broken man. Within a week, he announced his retirement. Within a month, a federal investigation into railroad corruption exposed a network of illegal contracts spanning 7 states. An investigation that, according to the official record, had begun with information from an anonymous source. Within a year, the legal precedent established through Dr. Hamilton's constitutional challenge, built in part on documentation gathered on a single train journey through Georgia and Alabama, began the slow dismantling of segregation in public transportation across the South. But as Bumpy Johnson stepped onto the platform at Union Station that evening, he wasn't thinking about civil rights or the slow arc of history. He was thinking, as he often was, about the next move. Morrison, the arrest, Hamilton's arrival, the confrontation with Whitmore, all of it had been preparation. The opening moves in a game that would take decades to complete. A game very few people would ever realize was being played at all. 10 years later, A reporter from the Atlanta Constitution sat across from Bumpy in a Harlem office, trying to understand how a single train ride had changed so much. "People say that night on the train was when you really became who you are," the reporter said. "That night wasn't about becoming anything," Bumpy said. "It was about showing people what I'd already become. Most folks think power is about making noise. Real power is about making moves so smooth that your enemies don't even know they've lost until it's too late." What happened to Whitmore after that night? James Whitmore taught me something about the difference between justice and revenge. Revenge is hot. It burns bright and then it's over. Justice is cold. Justice is patient. Justice is permanent. What the reporter didn't know was that destroying Whitmore's career had been the easy part. The harder part was what came after. The network of progressive politicians and civil rights lawyers that began appearing across the South in the years following that train ride. The network voters believed had emerged organically through grassroots momentum, had in fact been quietly cultivated and funded through channels that traced back to a man in a Harlem office who had once sat calmly by a train window while an entire car tried to understand what was happening to their world. The train ride was over, but the journey it began would continue for decades, carried forward by people who never knew where it had truly started. In a white Sony car, on an ordinary afternoon, when a man with a folded newspaper simply refused to move,